Welcome to SBC's webinar, Clearing Brazilian Regulatory Hurdles, the key to long-term success, in partnership with BetComply. Today, we will delve into the complexities of the Brazilian market, examining the regulatory landscape and its challenges as it stands right now. I'm Isadora Marcanti, Relationships Manager for Brazil at SBC, and I'll be stepping in for Elisa Marcanti, our business journalist, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. This webinar was carefully crafted by her, and I'll do my best to moderate it as effectively as she would have. With me to discuss this matter are Anton Yaras, Chief Operating Officer at Aviatrix, Mike de Graaf, Chief Compliance Officer at BetComply, Neil Montgomery, Founding and Managing Partner at Montgomery, and Scott Burrows, Head of Technical Compliance at Happening Superbet Group. How are you guys?
Very well.
Not too bad for Tuesday morning.
That's good. We're very excited to have you all here today. But let's get started. Given the high costs of meeting Brazil's regulatory requirements, how can operators and suppliers balance compliance with profitability in the long run?
Well, I can probably start on this by giving a little bit of context on the Brazilian market from a cost perspective. I think everyone that aims to go into Brazil or has applied for Brazil or has entered Brazil knows that it's a very costly licensing regime. There's a lot of startup costs involved into actually getting there. Besides the insane high licensing fee, it's also, of course, the heavy regulatory framework with ongoing compliance costs attached to it. What we have seen in other similar recently regulated markets is that because of the high costs of entry and because of the high fees involved, we see market penetration strategies trying to recoup that money as soon as possible. That then in turn results into non-compliant environments because we're trying to cut down costs on compliance to recoup the costs of getting into the market. And that immediately opens up the circle that I advocate for to avoid, which is don't try to penetrate the market non-compliantly and then afterwards complain that the government or the public opinion is against you and goes in with more restrictions, making it more difficult for you to recoup that investment.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in sort of other markets and more regulated markets, we can tie our risk appetite quite closely to where we see the regulator issuing fines and sanctions. We have none of that from the SPA yet. They're yet to fully show their teeth. Generally, when looking to sort of balance, as Mike says, that profitability side of it, we have to look at, okay, what is our risk appetite? At the moment, it's probably best to balance that versus the audit workbook. So where do you see the audit being placed, heavy reliance on? Is it RG? Is it geolocation? And then using that to sort of balance your risk versus profit across the market.
Yeah, and just a few words for us as a game provider. It's not so expensive. It's kind of an affordable jurisdiction, to be honest, which we are very happy about. Nevertheless, we've been a lot in discussion with Neil and Mike about the complexity of the market itself, that the Brazil is kind of a closed jurisdiction when it comes to payments, when it comes to execution of the international payments. So we kind of need to get into Brazil with our both arms and hands and everything. So yeah, but still it's not so bad.
And
yes.
You can go ahead.
No, just one final comment. We are also seeing that some of the licensed operators are trying to recoup part of the investment for those that have available slots, let's say, that applied with only one brand and still have two brands available. Some of them are trying to find business partners to take up those two slots and therefore recoup part of the hefty license fee and other startup costs that Mike mentioned at this initial moment as well.
Yeah. Well, talking about that, how do you see the role that the industry collaboration plays in navigating Brazil's complex regulatory environment, and how can operators, suppliers, and regulators, everyone actually, can work together more effectively?
Well, it ties a little bit in with the first question, which is the profitability on the long run, because I think like if you have collaborations along the lines of branch organizations and industry collaborations, we have seen some good examples in other markets of self-regulating instead of these operators trying to compete with each other on compliance standards in a downward spiral. So I do think that collaborating between operators can be very good to safeguard the license regime itself. But I also think that suppliers and providers need to realize that they are part of that licensing regime, even if they don't hold an actual license.
Yeah, we're a while away from true collaboration that we see in other markets, exactly as to what we were talking about before. Everyone's still trying to capture that initial market share. Until it's a little bit more stable, it's probably not going to happen outside of the general industry bodies. But completely agree with Mike. While suppliers aren't directly licensed, they are part of the regime. We should be looking at how best to support rather than sort of relying solely on our operators to confirm compliance. We need a little bit more buy-in from the likes of game providers and platform providers.
So, in your perspective, especially from like an outside company, what are the main compliance challenges that operators face when entering Brazil's newly regulated betting market? Because it was like just right now, like it was yesterday, 1st January, and how these companies can best prepare to overcome the difficulties that they may encounter throughout their operation.
Well, it was fun, and I don't say that lightly. Complex markets always are. I don't think we can answer this without talking about the Face ID requirements. It's certainly a first for me at this level. So requiring independent face recognition checks at various points in the life cycle. So they've not logged in for 7 days. Let me see your face on withdrawal, which I would have put it on deposit, but that's just compliance head on rather than commercial head. But that was a challenge technically, but we also have to look at the player experience. Players in Brazil sometimes use older devices that they're not using, the brand new flagship Samsungs or the brand new flagship iPhones. So the camera quality does play a little bit into how we have to implement this to take into account the lower end devices and what that does to the quality of facial recognition. I think the other big challenge is the almost US style level of geolocation, so VPN detection, dev tool detection, and jailbroken devices. While it is typical now as a requirement across multiple jurisdictions, when it's new to players, and we see this in most new regulated markets, you can see quite a lot of churn, especially at the beginning if you don't get that right. So more so get the messaging right, clear troubleshooting steps, and really allowing players to understand why we need the location. Probably not so much of a concern for new people entering now, but certainly one for us was the regulatory reporting from SIGAP, because it was being built alongside the market. There was a lot of quick change and change this report and slightly tweak that report as they were building the mirror and safe alongside the market opening. Whereas now, touch wood, it's fairly stable.
I think, Isadora, from a legal perspective, speaking as a lawyer, as we say here, Brazil is not for beginners, not for amateurs. It's a difficult jurisdiction. The legal framework can be even sometimes a bit draconian. So I think the entrance to the market, most of them being foreign companies that applied and obtained the license, are now facing the challenges of dealing with this complex legislation. Not only the very strict and burdensome regulatory requirements from the federal regulator, but also other legislation that exists and other realities. For example, Brazilian labor and employment laws that are quite strict, and also a new reality that may kick in sooner or later, depending on how many customers you have, which is the very treacherous, litigious environment of customer claims. Especially Brazil does have a system where most of these customer claims are litigated before what we call the small claims courts, where you can litigate disputes of up to 40 minimum salaries. And there is an incentive as well for consumers to go to these courts, because if your dispute involves an amount of up to 20 minimum salaries, you don't even need a lawyer to litigate those disputes. You need a lawyer between 20 and 40, and you don't have to pay any court fees. And really, there's no what we call succumbência fees as well, which is the defeated party in Brazil normally has to pay an amount of the judicial award to the lawyers of the winning party. So we don't have that. There's only, let's say, financial burdens if you appeal a first instance decision. So there is an incentive for consumers to go to court. And so I envisage operators facing maybe hundreds, if not thousands, of claims, depending on the size of the operator and the client portfolio in the years to come. So these are the challenges that they'll be facing from a legal perspective specifically.
Yeah, and as Neil said, and Mike said, that the market is not for rookies, not for the beginners. Even though the question was about the operators, even us, the game provider, by the time we applied for Brazil certificates for RGS, RNG, etc., even though we already had around 15 certificates, we still face some new things from the technical side, which we never saw before, that we need to implement. And as Scott said, multiplied by the complications within the country, the internet, etc., it became really a challenging one. So all of the market participants, I would say, they face something to their own extent.
Yeah, and don't forget that these face ID recognitions at I don't know how many points, the geolocation requirements, all the things attached to this framework, they cost money. That's one per check, per hit. So it's ongoing compliance cost. And if the quality of the product is not 120%, with every mishappening that you have, your churn increases, your profitability goes down. So, and if you have a framework that is so heavy on these type of requirements, and at the same time you don't have those providers checked in terms of a licensing or certification regime from a government perspective, if you make the wrong choice and you don't do the right due diligence on the product, you can end up with a product that is expensive and not working. And I think that's a deadly combination in a market if you are trying to recoup a very heavy investment.
Well, we talked about operators and what they face when they enter a new market, especially a new one like Brazil, where we've been where we're working as a black market for a long time. But B2B providers may be required to obtain licenses to operate in Brazil, just like B2C companies, as indicated by the SPA. When do you think this could happen? And do you believe that the licensing requirements for B2B providers is necessary and beneficial for the long-term development of a healthy market?
Isadora, the SPA, through its secretary, Regis Dudena, has publicly announced that this will probably be on the agenda for Q4 of this year. So what we have seen starting last year already, we have seen B2B providers already onshoring their operations to Brazil. First, because of demands and pressure given by the actual operators, because of our difficult tax system as well. It's easier and more cheaper for operators to have their B2B providers located in country to make payments of invoices locally in national currency, and so this makes it cheaper to operate with those B2B providers that are mostly overseas. So we have seen this onshoring trend already. It is very possible because this has been said by the SPA since mid-2024 that at one stage B2B providers will have to have a license, like other South American countries, for example, Peru. B2B providers have to have a license there as well. And so for those who already started to set up shop in Brazil, I think they are preparing well in advance of this requirement. I believe it will come. And there are many, let's say, advantages, especially for the consumer, for the operator, especially if these companies set up shop in Brazil. Because just like the operators, it will provide a local door to knock on if things go wrong. If, for example, a B2B provider's game malfunctions and causes damages to the player, then it's of course going to be easier for the player not only to sue the operator, but also the B2B provider, who are jointly and severally liable under our consumer legislation.
Thanks, Neil. I'm a really big fan of B2B licensing. I think it's such a really good idea for a mature market. It does remain to be seen, although we know they're going to come in Q4, whether that's only going to be game providers or whether they're going to extend that out to platform providers and, in some cases, other service providers that we see in other markets. Both versions have pros and cons, but as a minimum, game providers and platforms are beneficial long term. It allows us as operators to know that we're working with not only licensed and approved providers, that in turn means less risk, but it also allows us to not take all of that compliance responsibility and be able to say to the likes of Anton, we need this on your game. This is the reason why.
So yeah, my opinion is a little bit less popular among the colleagues because I'm not a big fan of B2B licenses, to be honest. Because I think that the main value when it comes to compliant market and compliant relations, uh, we as a game provider, we bring it through compliant products, through responsible gaming, through tailoring features that we have in the game towards what the legislation is, and therefore our B2B licenses are normally, they look like mostly a background check of the founders because there are not so many burdens and obligations that we get together with the B2B license. We still can do our business in a manner that, because it remains unseen to the regulators, to the end users, we still do the B2B sales. We don't have marketing limitations. So I can see that having a B2B license is a good thing for a country, for jurisdictions, can because you can get some extra money in the budget, which is great. But I think that we have zero examples of properly working B2B licenses where the companies are not allowed to be presented both in the unregulated and regulated fields. Like the latest case with UKGC and Evolution. I mean, everybody acted surprised that Evolution is somewhere else except for the UK. So it does not seem like it works if we talk about the historical perspective. So
Yeah,
but
I
but we would be, I
I
hope
do
we would
agree.
be the first ones to get one once it's once it's introduced.
Yeah, we'll make sure that happens if it happens. I do agree indeed with Anton that there's in terms of obligations and contributing to the framework, a B2B licensing does not do much more than checking the UBOs, etc. I also do think that B2B licensing regime should not be there for the sake of fees and taxation, because there is already enough on that side from the operator side. I think it's more important when it comes to like points of contact, the liability and responsibility. Because in the case, yeah, for example, in the Netherlands, where it is a B2C licensing regime and a certification regime for games, the operators are liable for every single game that is on the platform, even though if it is certified or not, they are liable for it. And at the same time, these operators sometimes, or these providers sometimes, also service the black market in the meantime. So they're eating on two sides of the cake, while the responsibility lies with the operator in that sense. So from that point of view, I do agree that a B2B licensing regime could make sense. Now, it being sort of announced or expected by the end of this year is really fast, but it is also kind of an example for how fast Brazil is developing. You know, we're not even 3 months in, and there's already talks of a B2B licensing regime. There's already talks of advertising banning. There's already talks about A, B, and C. It's basically what I would say the worst parts about previous regulated markets, but then in an acceleration, even. And I don't think that that is a good development per se. And what Scott also says, it really depends also to what extent the B2B licensing regime is going to be, because a game provider. So if you have a game provider that is now on your platform and that game does not get licensed for any reason, okay, the game needs to be removed from the platform. That's not a super big impact. But what if the B2B licensing regime extends to your platform, to your PAM, and it turns out that the platform you have been using is not able to get a license? Now, then you suddenly have to do a platform migration, suddenly within a year or 2 years after operating, and that is not something you want to be in as a position. Um, And if it extends to service providers like geolocation or KYC, etc., because there is a heavy emphasis on this in the framework, then it goes without saying that is even more crucial, that you actually have a provider that you know is capable of getting licensed when it comes.
Yeah, and Mike, just to touch on Brazil's changing and quickly, the consultation plan which they've published, there is a consultation on some point of the regulation every month for the next year, at least. So it's already open consultations looking at the first one's esports. How many more of those are we going to see as the months go on? This market certainly isn't going to stand still.
And we have to remember as well that land-based casinos and bingo parlors have yet not been legalized in Brazil. So hopefully the legal framework needs to be closed before we can tackle B2B licenses, hopefully. And hopefully we'll see the land-based casinos and the bingo parlors being legalized this year. There was an expectation of that happening last year. It didn't happen. It nearly happened at the end of last year, but hopefully 2025 we'll see the legalization of finally of the land-based verticals.
Well, we were just like Mike just mentioned also like some consequences that the companies can face if I'm an operator and I'm partnering up, or I have a B2B supplier on my platform that doesn't comply with the regulations or with the license when it comes. What will happen to these operators or to the suppliers? We know that they won't be able to operate in Brazil, but to the operators, the sports betting sites, because I remember that we were concerned, especially last year, when we saw the football clubs partnering it up and being sponsored by a lot of operators, and the operator doesn't get a federal license or a state license, or only get a state license, and the football club is in another state different than the state that issued the license. We were concerned about what was going to happen to these football clubs, what was going to happen to these operators, to the contracts that they had, and to the money involved. How will this be if B2B providers need to have a license and they don't comply with the rules? What are the consequences both for the operator and for the suppliers?
Yeah, for the suppliers, if we're talking game providers and platform providers, I think it's quite fairly straightforward for them. Meaning, if you don't get a license, you pull out of the regulated market. And we all know then they're going to just serve as the illegal market in that sense, because they did gain market share somehow and they want to retain that. That's another story. I think the impact really comes when a platform provider or a critical service supplier is on your platform that doesn't get licensed or gets rejected for the license. Because then you have either a platform migration, or you have critical changes to your platform that require recertification of the platform, and all in the first 2-3 years of you trying to recoup the heavy investment that you have done. And then the last thing I think you want to do is change your whole platform or change critical elements of your platform.
Yeah, and we also should not forget about the end users and the consequences that will be there, because I still think that in any given operator, when it comes to game providers, there is a very few game titles that get all of the cash, get all of the revenue, and therefore these guys would always be able to get the B2B license. And as the supply is much bigger in the game provider sphere than the demand, I think that we will still see the regulated titles both here and there, and nothing would really change except for someone would not be able to work.
Neil, from a legal perspective, like, I don't know if I'm sure you've seen that in other markets. I don't know if you have an opinion, or if you see something like we saw in another market happening in Brazil as well, because we know that our regulation is very different from other countries and the process is different as well.
Mm-hmm. It's more on the lines that Mike was saying, indeed. If you don't get the license or you're not complying, you'll be kicked out of the regulated market. And so since operators are under the scrutiny of the federal regulator, then they must keep 100% compliant at all times. So they need to take care with whom they work with. And if the B2B provider either doesn't get a license when necessary or is not compliant with the Brazilian legislation, they just need to terminate them, unfortunately.
Yeah,
And is there
it's very hard. Sorry, so it's very hard to hide it as well with Brazil, as we see in any market with a safe server. All they'll do is exactly as we've seen with the game providers. They want the license and certificate number sent into the regulatory reporting. So the second you don't have a certificate number, you ultimately can't be used in the market because we can't report it accurately.
Yeah. And besides Isadora, not only the game providers or the platform providers, but another very important provider in the market at the moment are affiliates and especially influencers. Under Brazilian consumer laws, everyone that somehow belongs to the supply chain is jointly and severally liable with the supplier of goods and services. So the operator is jointly and severally liable with its influencers, with its affiliates. So the responsible gaming ordinance of the SPA even expressly mentions that influencers and affiliates are jointly and severally liable with the operator. So there has been, let's say, a revamping of that advertising model as well, because operators now need to probably train, educate, and control what their influencers, what their affiliates are doing, not to get into trouble, especially because of this joint and several liability. And we have seen cases in 2024 when things got quite ugly, and with influencers even being arrested as well in Brazil. So that is another point of concern and care that licensed operators must take care.
like from an operator perspective as well, like how, and even a supplier company, but even if that the company is legalized and I mean outside Brazil, but like it's legal, does everything by the book, and it doesn't get the license in Brazil, how do operators and the suppliers can protect themselves if this comes to place? Because we're not expecting that. I mean, we know that this can happen and this might happen, as pointed out by the SPA, but we don't know what the requirements will be. Like we saw when the technical requirements came in, and then we had the QIC onboarding. We didn't have that. Like some companies didn't see this in other markets, and now we see that in Brazil, and this changed costs and implementations and so on. So how do operators and suppliers can protect themselves if this B2B license comes into place, so they don't get caught by like surprise or don't know what to do exactly when they see all the requirements that they might not have in other markets that they already operate in?
Yeah. Well, I think the most straightforward answer is you need a guy like Neil in their contractual agreements, because this should be covered within the agreements between the operators and the platform providers, for example. That if something like this changes in the regime, that the obligation of the platform is to adhere to the new obligations, etc. And this should already be baked in your contractual agreements with them. If not, they should be revised and broken open in that sense a little bit, because that I think is where the core is. Because if you take the example of a platform provider, so you have a third-party platform provider that you use for your to do your B2C operations. Now, if that platform, for whatever reason, does not get the B2B license, then you don't only have the whole migration issue, but you also have you as an operator then breaking the agreement with your platform provider, or the other way around, because these are multi-year deals usually. And if they have to suddenly get ended for this reason, the platform provider has no interest or no gain from any further collaboration in this. So you're not going to get a very helpful partner if you are breaking the agreement and tell them to support your migration to a new platform. This is not going to be very happy land, let's say. So I think this should already be baked in your contractual agreements. So part of what we do is when we are helping providers and operators collaborate and enter new markets, even if the provider itself is not licensed but only certified or only involved in the framework, we do build frameworks with them as if they are licensed, meaning that they need to know how they contribute to this framework, even if they are not licensed themselves yet, to not be surprised when you do.
Yeah, and if we're talking about B2Bs entering the market, it should be considerably easier now, especially if you're already live. You've got a live platform that should already be complying with all the regulations. It is going to come down to that, as Anton was touching on. Who's the ultimate beneficial owner? What does that look like? And it's more going to be a paper exercise for at least the majority of the reputable platform providers. At least one would hope.
Well, this is more of legal and risk question. So I don't know if Mike and Neil, the man you should have in your company working with you if you decide to enter Brazil, want to answer this one. But the M&A market is quite common in the online betting industry. And in Brazil, some companies have already shown interest in joining forces, such as BetMais and Casa de Apostas, OKTO and U4C, Flutter and NSX Group, and WA Technology and OnCO. We know that this market is expected to continue growing in the coming years, but how important is the M&A market for a developing sector such as Brazil, and what are the main impacts for the country and the betting market itself if more companies begin to merge in the long run?
Okay, Isadora, I think M&A is going to be something that we're going to see a lot in 2025. Maybe not in the first half, but more in the second half of 2025. And there are legal reasons to support that this is the best year to engage in M&A activity. First of all, we have many applicants that obtained a license, that applied for a license to monetize and have a return on their investment. So there are many license holders who are eagerly looking for buyers, either to buy the whole company, so the whole license with the three brand slots. Others may be looking for joint venture opportunities, maybe to share some of the slots they have available. We also have those foreign operators that decided not to apply for a license. Some went to the very end of the license and application and decided to pull out for whatever reasons. Maybe they thought Brazil was too costly, too difficult to operate, and maybe we could see large foreign operators looking again more carefully to Brazil, to those companies that obtained the license and return to the Brazilian market by M&A. And I said 2025 is going to be a good year. First of all, because the market is very new. And Brazil, as I said at the beginning, is not for beginners. Due diligence always plays a very vital role in any M&A transaction, not only legal and finance, but also in Brazil, reputational due diligence is always a concern. We have had problems in the past, and Brazilian companies, if they're traditional Brazilian companies, not all of them are ready to engage in these sorts of transactions with foreign companies that are subject to KYC and compliance obligations. So there may be some training needed to get fully Brazilian companies ready to be sold. But there's a big advantage from a legal perspective this year, which is these M&A transactions are not going to be small. We saw, for example, Flutter have to pay $350 million for a controlling stake in NSX. So we're talking about big money here. And when we're talking about big money, normally we have to think about merger review control, competition, antitrust authority. And for this specific market, which is brand new, started on the 1st of January, there is a very good opportunity because in principle, you would not need to apply for merger review control this year, even if the companies involved in the transaction meet the competition thresholds, which would be group gross turnover in Brazil on one side of 75 million reais and on the other side 750 million reais, because CADE, which is our antitrust authority, always takes into account the figures of the immediately previous financial year. In 2024, of course, we did not have a regulated market. There was no such market. So in principle, there would be no such figures to consider. So 2025 would be a window of opportunity to get those M&A transactions done, at least signed, to avoid an additional layer of cost, complexity, and uncertainty, which would be merger review control. So if you are to engage in M&A, 2025 is the year to do that in the gaming industry.
I would like to add something on this from a previous example that is it's public out there, so I'll give the example. But you do not, as a foreign investor trying to buy your way into a newly regulated market, you don't want to end up the way that Entain and Bad City ended up, which is in court with each other. How do these kind of situations come to life? So if you have a very heavily regulated market with very high cost of entry, and your intention is to enter that market, penetrate that market, and sell to a foreign investor, the issue on the buyer's side is the lack of due diligence on the actual operational compliance and technical compliance of the product. Meaning that, okay, you have a very big market share, you do very big revenue, etc. But how are you actually doing? And if I'm buying this company, will the revenue even hold up the same way, or do I need to change so many things that the revenue will go down by 30-40%? Meaning valuation is going off by 1, 2, 3, 400 million. These, like Neil says, this is big money games, and what we have seen in previous acquisitions mostly is that there's a lack of due diligence on the actual operational compliance of the database itself. So be watchful for it.
Well, before we go, I have a question here very interesting actually, from Deborah Benitez. And she asked, do you believe that it is feasible for providers and operators, aggregators, platforms to use the double taxation agreement between Brazil and another country precisely to avoid the need to open a company in Brazil and to make taxation more attractive?
Maybe I can answer a little bit that one. Double tax treaties can be useful. Not necessarily do they eliminate all the tax burden. That's why many times, even with the existence of double tax treaties, it's worthwhile to have a local entity. The beauty of having a local entity from the foreign B2B provider's perspective is that if it has low costs in Brazil and can produce a lot of profit, those profits can be repatriated as dividend payments, which at the moment are not subject to any withholding income tax. So that is the beauty of the dividend payment structure in Brazil. Double tax treaties do help. We don't have too many of those double tax treaties going around, but they still, there are other taxes sometimes and contributions that are not covered by the double tax treaties because they are mostly referred to income tax and withholding taxes. But we have other taxes like CDPs, COFINS, ISS, which need to be taken into account as well. So most of the times, setting up a local subsidiary, even if it has very low, let's say, recurring costs, could be the way to go because of the beauty of the dividend payment structure. I know the federal government is about to put forward to Congress a tax reform tackling income tax specifically. They have already put forward and approved a tax reform on consumption taxes. So the consumption taxes are going to change in a couple of years' time. And of course, the gaming industry has been targeted as well. There's discussion of including gaming in the imposto seletivo. It's the sin tax, which could increase even further the tax burden for operators in Brazil. And the next stage of that tax reform will be to tackle personal income tax and corporate income tax. And so the government does want potentially to change the existing scenario where dividends are not taxed by withholding income tax. That could change in the future. But so far, as things stand today and have stood since January of 1996, there is 0% withholding income tax on dividend payments made from a Brazilian company to its shareholders overseas. And the beauty is that regardless of where the shareholder is located, whether or not in a tax haven, it's still zero. Because for all other remittances, the withholding income tax could be either 15% if you're not located in a tax haven, or there's an extra surtax of 10%, moving it up to 25 if the beneficiary is located in a tax haven. And Brazil has a very long list of tax havens. It's your usual suspects. Many of those jurisdictions are hubs for gaming companies, so you always have to look out and involve your tax advisors when planning to do business in Brazil.
Well, thank you so much, Mike, Anton, and Scott. It was a pleasure meeting you for the first time and doing this webinar with you. Neil, always great seeing you and doing work with you. That was amazing. It was a very nice webinar and enlightening. Thank you very much. I'm sure our audience really enjoyed it as well. Thank you, guys, and I hope to see you soon again in the webinar or in person.
Thank you.
Thank
Always
you.
great fun.
Attention.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.